Hi there. Hopefully, you took a few moments to refresh the mind. And we're going to conclude our conversations and series of lectures here on bodily systems with the immune system in Unit 7, which correlates to Chapter 11 in your textbook. So let's get to our information here and wrap up these systems, and then we'll be able to start applying this information in the subsequent units. All right, so first things first, let's talk about antigens and immunity, something we've been hearing a lot recently in the news. Antigens is a foreign molecule that is capable of stimulating an immune response. In general, they have to be rather large substances or molecules, or large proteins or polysaccharides or something of that nature. So generally, we get in and start thinking about the lymph tissue. There's a network of lymphatic vessels. The fluid helps carry, the fluid that they carry is called lymph. Tissue macrophages filter the lymph for disease-causing organisms constantly. And so the lymph just travels passively. It's not really pumped or pushed. It just kind of passively moves and flows up and down the lymph system. Here's a diagram of a dog and the number of different lymph nodes that will be located in various locations across the body. Of course, then the spleen is a large reddish-brown organ. It's usually attached kind of right around the stomach area. It's kind of long and slender, reddish-brown. Contains a large number of immune cells, and it's exceedingly important in helping you fight off pathogens. So it kind of scans the blood for antigens all the time, and it serves as kind of a reservoir for the red blood cells that we talked about early in the unit. And it's really, even though we talk about its importance, you can live without it. Those red blood cells can maintain circulating in the blood and be healthy enough and be reproduced often enough that you could get by without your spleen if necessary. But it's important to know that it does serve a pretty critical factor. And so removing it is no small deal. Here's an example of tumors that are located in this patient and how they've swollen up. And actually, you see a lot of inflammation and red blood cell response trying to fight off that infection around it. All right. Additionally, of course, we have then bone marrow that produces and stores white blood cells that are, of course, really important in the function of the immune system. Also, a huge part, of course, of fighting off pathogens, antigens, and immunity is fever. It's specifically done to aid in the fight of pathogens. It's your body's natural response whenever there's a pathogen that invades it, to have this little bit of inflammation that stimulates white blood cell production to attack whatever pathogen is there. Now, it should hinder the replication of an infectious organism or actually kill it whenever that body temperature rises. So, but it doesn't always do it right away. But that normal body response to have a fever when infected with a pathogen is somewhat normal to some degree. You just don't want it to get out of hand and let it cause other problems. The diagram here to the right, of course, is the normal rectal temperatures on the various species that we'll talk about and have interest in this section. Next is, of course, what we know as inflammation, usually a result of or a response to physical injury. Sometimes a reaction to an invasive pathogen, also depending upon where it's at. What it does is increases capillary permeability, allowing more blood flow and more lymph tissue and more white blood cell, of course, access to the area of inflammation or the area where the pathogen has permeated. So we get more fluid to the tissues. And that large number of white blood cells kind of comes in and acts like an army to attack the invader. Next is in terms of the antigen and immunity responses, lymphocytes. These are B cells or B lymphocytes. They usually only respond to one antigen. So they're very specific when we talk about immunity. These B cell types are built towards specific immune responses oftentimes. So the plasma cells secrete the antibody, and the antibody production occurs in the lymph nodes, the spleen, and or the bone marrow. And these B cells then can recognize particular binding sites for particular pathogens. So as you are exposed to different pathogens, you build this antibody response. All right, so let's talk about passive and active immunity. Both are critically important. Um, Non-specific or innate immunity is where we have phagocytic cells that just really quickly engulf any bacteria. The neutrophils typically offer the initial response, signaled by some kind of tissue damage. This is really active immunity. Um, the primary response takes about 3 to 14 days for significant antibody production. So when you talk about giving vaccinations or you're invaded with a pathogen, it takes a little bit of incubation time and some time for your body to respond to fight that particular bacteria or virus off. You'll see some clonal cells develop, which is kind of a memory cell, so that the body remembers when they're attacked with that pathogen the next time. Most of the time, plasma cells usually only survive about 4 to 5 days, and then they are expelled. The secondary response is then from developing an infectious disease the second time. So this immune response is highly effective at preventing the same disease and occurring a second time. So, for example, if an animal gets a case of pneumonia as a young calf and develops really good immunity, then they should be if they develop that immunity effectively, they should be very astute at fighting that off, the body doing it itself, fighting it off in a subsequent infection. But the response is very specific. Viruses, especially as we know, have many different strains. They mutate constantly. Uh, there's a lot dependent upon how many vectors or reservoirs, whether it's human or animal, that can harbor those specific pathogens. But generally speaking, the more that they mutate, the less virulent they get, unless they're just becomes a situation where there's really no immune response to it, then you see an outbreak case occur. Passive immunity, kind of continuing, we talk about T lymphocytes. These are a cell-mediated response. Two types of T cells, the helper cell, the T helper cell, a stimulated immune response, or cytotoxic cells, which are attacking any damaged cells that are in the body. So disease protection then comes from memory cells, whether it's modified live vaccines, modified toxin vaccines, which would be killed vaccines, or SRP vaccines. The modified lives are actually live viral loads that are modified to the extent that they really can't cause the disease typically, and you will actually shed the disease, but it will help you with fighting off and triggering immune response. It gets your antibody titers actually much higher than a killed vaccine response. So active immunity, whenever you've had an active disease problem, usually you'll have then antibody titers for many years or even a lifetime to come. So that active immunity is very critical. In addition, when we talk about passive immunity, is you have to think about antibodies transfer from one animal to another. So specifically, we would be referring to colostrum consumption here. Really, a super critical time in the immune building response of a young animal, whether it's a young piglet or a young foal or young calf, whatever it might be. That mama has the opportunity through colostrum to pass along a lot of initial immunity to those offspring when they consume colostrum, and that's very critical that they consume it, within 3 hours and especially within 6 hours after birth, so that they can help build that immune response. There are some commercial products out there where they have harvested antibodies from plasma of highly vaccinated animals that you can supplement that with. But I'll tell you, nothing is as good as natural immunity in transfer from mama and colostrum. It's very critical that you get that done appropriately. All right, wrapping up here and talking about clinical significance. And of course, vaccines are available in a lot of different forms, and most of them are injectable. There are a few that are intranasal, and of course, we talked about earlier modified lives. It's important to have something that you think or at least suspect will work against the strain you are trying to vaccinate against, and specifically when we talk about respiratory diseases. Next, not all immune reactions work to prevent disease in animals. Sometimes we get sensitization where the immune response to certain antigens just doesn't trigger for some reason. You'll on occasion get anaphylaxis where you get an allergic reaction. Uh, Anytime that happens, that sometimes can be very life threatening, so be aware of that. Of course, your immune system can often help be used to make diagnostics. We can blood test animals and measure antibody titers to see what specific diseases they've been exposed to, or use ELISA tests to measure the level of progesterone and hormones and antibodies in milk. Um, so there are a number of different things that we can test for in the immune system that can be indicative of diseases that they may have encountered. Autoimmune diseases are those that attack the self, and there's really often no explainable cause of some of those. But autoimmune disorders are very problematic and very difficult to treat. All right, so summing up this section as we complete our series of mini lectures on different bodily systems, the endocrine system provides a lot of communication throughout the body through different hormones. And so make sure you are able to differentiate hormones and their function because then once we know what they do and what they're supposed to act upon, we can then know how to manipulate them. Identify the relationships between antigens and antibodies and how the body reacts to those different substances. And then lastly, explain the importance of animal health maintenance. How do we keep animals on a high level of health plane so that number one, they have a lot of high immunity themselves, they're able to pass on good immunity to their offspring and fight off disease whenever it encounters them. Thanks for tuning in into this section. I look forward to interacting with you in Canvas in this module.